My friends thought they were being funny. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the embarrassment, not the logistics of what happened after, but the fact that three grown men sat across a restaurant booth the week before and genuinely believed this was a good idea, that it would be entertaining, that I would see the setup for what it was and laugh along, and we would all go home having had a story to tell. They were right about the story. They were wrong about everything else. My name is James Calloway. I'm 36. I design custom furniture, mostly residential, occasionally commercial, out of a workshop I rent in an industrial block about 12 minutes from my apartment. It's not glamorous. I smell like sawdust by 10 in the morning, and I own more clamps than a reasonable person requires, and my hands look like I've been in a disagreement with a belt sander, which, regularly, I have. I eat lunch alone most days because I like the quiet. I am, according to my friend group, too serious for someone who makes chairs for a living. My friends are Ryan Callum and a man named Todd, who insists on going by T and has for 11 years, and we have all quietly accepted this. They are good people, with poor judgment. I say this with genuine affection. They once booked a ski trip to a mountain with no snow because they didn't read past the first line of the listing. This is the baseline. The prank was Ryan's idea, which tracks. The concept was simple, which is how bad ideas always start. They had arranged a blind date for me through a mutual connection, a woman named Poppy, who they described, when briefing me as, quote, not exactly your type, said with the tone of people enjoying a secret. They told me she was loud. They told me she talked too much. They told me she was a bit much for most people. They did not tell me anything accurate. I arrived at the restaurant, a mid-range Italian place with candles that were slightly too tall for the tables, at 7. I was early because I am always early. I told the host I was meeting someone, and she walked me to a two-top near the window, and I ordered water and looked at the menu and thought about whether this was a waste of an evening. Then Poppy arrived. I heard her before I saw her, which is what Ryan had prepared me for. Except the sound I heard was her apologizing to the host for being 3 minutes late and asking if there was a coat rack she wasn't seeing. This is not the sound of someone who is a lot. This is the sound of someone being careful in an unfamiliar place. She came around the partition and stopped when she saw me, and there was a half-second of something moving across her face. Recalibration, the same look I suspect was on mine. And then she smiled. Not the bright, performing smile of someone trying to make a good impression. The smaller one. The one that means, okay, this is real now. She was wearing a dark blue dress and carrying a canvas bag with a paint stain on the left side that she had not tried to hide. Her hair was slightly uneven in a way that suggested she had done it herself. She had earrings that were different lengths. I noticed all of this in the way you notice the details of something you want to remember, which is different from observation, and I understood that distinction immediately. And it annoyed me. She sat down and looked at the table and said, "They told you something about me, didn't they?" It wasn't a question. I said, "Some things." She said, "Was it the loud thing or the too much thing?" I said, "Both, actually." She picked up her menu and looked at it without expression and said, "Yep, that tracks." I said, "For what it's worth, you haven't been either so far." She said, "Give it time." But her mouth moved like she was trying not to smile, and that small resistance did something immediate to the evening. I will tell you what Ryan had actually done because I didn't learn it until later, and it reframes everything. Poppy was not a random setup. She was the younger sister of Callum's girlfriend, a ceramic artist who had just relocated to the city and didn't know many people. And Ryan had decided that setting her up with me as a prank was hilarious because, as he explained afterward with startling confidence, you two are both weird about your craft, so either you'd hate each other or it'd be too perfect, and either way it's funny. This is the level of planning we are dealing with. Poppy knew it was a setup. She did not know it had been framed as a prank. That was the piece she was missing, and I made the decision in the first 10 minutes of dinner not to tell her because there was nothing funny about it and she deserved a regular evening. We ordered. She got the pasta with the long name and asked the waiter 2 questions about the sauce that were specific enough to suggest she actually cared. I got the chicken. She raised an eyebrow at the chicken. I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing. You just look like a pasta person." I said, "I look like a pasta person." She said, "You have patient hands." Pasta people have patient hands. I looked at my hands. The belt sander disagreement from 3 days prior was still visible. I said, "I work with wood." Her face changed, not dramatically the way a room changes when someone opens a window. She said, "What kind?" And I told her. And she told me she worked with clay. And we compared notes for 20 minutes on drying times and shrinkage, and the particular frustration of a material that has its own opinions about what it wants to become. She had a small scar on her right thumb from a kiln shelf she'd dropped 2 years ago. She showed me without being asked, because I'd mentioned my own from a chisel that had slipped, and she held her hand across the table like it was a reasonable thing to share between two people who were still strangers. It was. That's the thing. It was completely reasonable. That was the problem. I have poor survival instincts around women who treat honesty like a default setting. Dinner lasted 2 hours. We didn't notice. The candles burned down to the holder, and the waiter replaced them once without commenting. She talked about her work with the particular restraint of someone who loves a thing so much they're afraid of how much they'll say if they start. I recognize that restraint because I have it about the same thing. At one point, she described trying to replicate a glaze she'd seen in a museum and spending 4 months on it. And she said it with the tired satisfaction of someone who had made peace with an obsession. And I thought, in a way I had not thought about anyone in recent memory. I understand exactly what that is. Outside afterward on the pavement, it had gotten cold. She pulled her coat closed with one hand and held the canvas bag with the other and looked up the street for a cab. I said, "Can I tell you something?" She looked at me. I said, "The guys who set this up, they described it to me as a prank. I want you to know that was them being idiots, not a reflection of anything true. And I'm sorry you were the setup for someone's bit." She went still, not dramatically, just still. I kept going because silence with Poppy, I was already learning, was not always empty. I said, "I'm also aware that I should have led with that and didn't. And the reason I didn't is because the evening was good and I didn't want it to become about that," which I recognized was a selfish call. She looked at me for a long moment. The silver light from a passing car moved across her face. Then her expression did something quiet and complicated, and her eyes went bright in the way eyes go when something lands in an unexpected place. She said, "I knew something was off about the way it was framed. I just didn't know what." I said, "I'm sorry." She shook her head once, slowly, not as a dismissal, as a no, that's not what this is. Then she laughed once, a small, breathless sound, and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked away. When she looked back, her eyes were wet. I said, "I didn't mean to." She said, No, that's not bad. That's the opposite of bad. I'm just not used to someone saying the thing." I said, "The thing." She said, "The thing that could have stayed hidden. Most people don't. Most people just let the version that's comfortable stay comfortable." She looked at her shoes for a moment, then she said, "Thank you for telling me." I said, "I'd like to see you again, if that's something you'd want." She turned her ring, a ceramic band I noticed that she had probably made herself, once around her finger. She said, "I'm free Thursday." Not maybe. Not I'll think about it. Thursday. Like she'd already made the calculation and trusted the result. I have poor survival instincts. Thursday felt like good news anyway. Ryan texted me at 10:45 that night. "So, how was the prank? LOL." I sent back, "We're getting dinner Thursday." He didn't reply for 6 minutes, which is the longest Ryan has ever taken to reply to anything. When he did, it was just, "Wait, actually?" I didn't respond. I went to sleep feeling unreasonably calm, which is how I know when something matters. That was 2 years ago. Poppy still has the canvas bag with a paint stain. She has added a clay smear to the other side, which she says is balance, and which I suspect is stubbornness. She works in the apartment 2 evenings a week, at the table by the window, and she leaves a fine white dust on everything she touches, and I have stopped minding this in a way that would have previously seemed unlikely. She came to my workshop once, early on, and walked through it without speaking for 10 minutes, picking things up and setting them down, running her hand along a half-finished cabinet. And then she turned and said, "You make things that are meant to last." I told her I tried. She said, "No, you do." She said it the way she says things she means, which is quietly and without decoration. She still shows me her hands when something is new. The small scar has a companion now, from a wire tool in February. I have 3 more from the past year, which she catalogs with a kind of fond exasperation. Years later, when people ask how we met, she tells it with the paint stain bag detail because she says it's the most accurate image of who she was that night. A person who hadn't tried to hide anything coming in and hadn't been asked to hide anything going out. She says the part about the prank without bitterness now, mostly because Ryan has never fully recovered his credibility in either of our eyes, which is in its own way the best possible outcome. I didn't fall in love with Poppy Walsh because she cried on a pavement in the cold over someone telling the truth. I fell in love because the thing that moved her was honesty treated as ordinary, because she held her hand across a restaurant table, like a reasonable thing to do, because 4 months on a glaze is not a detour. It's the whole story, and she knew that, and I knew she knew it. The only difference now is that we say it out loud. What would you have done if you found out a date had been framed as a joke before you'd even arrived? And have you ever had someone tell you the uncomfortable thing when they could have stayed quiet and felt it change something? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.